Warner. I'm one of the two co-directors of Circle, the Center for Educational Resources in Culture, Language, and Literacy, together with Beatrice Dupuis. And I'm also here with Kate Mackay, who's our associate director. And I'm very excited about today's event. Before we get to the main webinar, I have just a couple of announcements to share with you as well. All right. Many of you will already be familiar with Circle, but just in case you're not, Circle is the Center for Educational Resources in Culture, Language, and Literacy. We are one of 16 Title VI language resource centers in the US. And so if you're not already familiar with the work that we do, please do go to our website and to the main LRC website and get to know us a little bit better. The webinar that we're doing today is part of a series. So we wanted to let you know we do have another upcoming workshop on December 8th, and registration will be open for that soon. And the topic is on language learners becoming filmmakers, connecting STEM digital literacies and language arts. And our presenters for that are Veronica Ogilvie, Jill Kastick, Jessica Summers, and Leah Falco. So we hope to see many of you there as well. And then we also have another upcoming event, which is the Intercultural Competence Conference that we host. This particular event coming up in January will be a virtual event. So registration will be coming for that soon too. And the topic is decentering mobility and intercultural education, engagement, equity, and access. And we have a really exciting set of speakers planned for that, including Uju Anya, Maria Dosley, and Jennifer Pipitone. All right, now moving to today's event, Building Bridges Across Cultures Through Global Inquiry with Children, with our presenters, Kathy Short and Dorea Kleker. I'm just going to do a brief introduction and I'm going to turn it over to them. I'm really excited to have both of them here today for this webinar. So Kathy Short is a professor and endowed chair of Global Children's Literature in the College of Education at the University of Arizona. She's also the founding director of Worlds of Words, Center of Global Literacies and Literatures. If you visit our campus, I strongly encourage you to go there. It's just a magical kind of space. She's also served as the president of the National Council of Teachers of English and the US Board of Books for Young People. And her work focuses on curriculum development with global literature in K-12 classes, with a focus on dialogue and inquiry. She's worked extensively with teachers from all over the world on literature-based approaches and has authored a number of books. I'm going to highlight just one, including creating classrooms for authors and inquirers and teaching globally, reading the world through literature, which is a co-authored book and a wonderful introduction. Dorea Kleker is here with us today as well. She's an early childhood teacher, educator, and lecturer at the University of Arizona, and her work focuses on global and multicultural children's literature, literacy, and play for developing intercultural understandings, and the use of literature to actively engage children as inquirers across all content areas. She's worked with students and teachers across a really wide variety of educational contexts in the US and Latin America, including, I'm fortunate to say, at my own kids' school. So I'm really excited to have them both here today, and I'm going to now turn it over to Kathy and Dorea. Welcome.
Great, welcome everybody. Kathy and I are delighted to get to share our work around building bridges across cultures through inquiry with children. Our work is really grounded in the understanding that we live in an interconnected world, economically, socially, culturally, and politically, and that children, as global citizens of this world, often come to see it in the way that the media presents it to them, full of danger, conflict, disaster, and violence. And our work has really been in supporting teachers and engaging teachers and children in thoughtful explorations of global cultures in ways that really allow them to connect to the ways that people live, feel, and think within these cultures, rather than those information-driven country reports that so many of us remember from our own schooling. We want children to be open to learning both about and from cultures that differ from their own. Both Kathy and I, as Chantel mentioned, have worked with children and teachers, undergraduate students and graduate students in a variety of contexts, engaging them in global inquiries. However, today we're really focused on the work that we've done with children, specifically in an after-school global cultures program that we ran at a local elementary school here in Tucson, alongside colleagues from India, South Korea, and New Zealand. And in this space, we really wanted to move beyond the types of cultural explorations we saw happening in classrooms. So those are things like the country reports, those fact-driven country reports that I mentioned earlier, or art activities, those that are teacher-directed and often culminate in students producing a final product. What instead we wanted to do was really provide spaces for children's own inquiries into global cultures to explore their connections, their curiosities, and their tensions in ways that really centered children as the problem posers and teachers as co-inquirers and co-learners alongside them.
What we need to do is to give you a couple of quick frames that were really important to us related to this work. Most of what we're going to be sharing with you today are the actual strategies that we used with the children, many of which we've also, as Dorea said, have adapted and used with our university students. But before we start with those practical ideas, we wanted to give you the frame for what we were thinking about as we tried to move from activities to what we considered more of a thoughtful curriculum. One of those is, I think, probably a model that's very familiar to many of you, which is thinking about culture as being very dynamic and existing within a systemic whole, that culture is something that is a set of beliefs. It's not a static set of beliefs or traditions, but it's ways that people live and be and are present in the world. That create a particular design for living in a certain community. And one of the things that we're aware of is that the iceberg concept of culture makes evident is that often in schools, we focus on what's above the water, which are the surface aspects of culture that are easily visible, often related to the arts, music, drama, foods, fashions, festivals. And those things are an important part of that culture, but what's below the surface are what are the deep values of that culture, those values and belief in which those actions and traditions are embedded. And that's one of the things we wanted to do, was to not just have the surface, but to connect the surface to the deep culture. We also found this model from Elsie Begler, who talks about that when we study world cultures, that we need to really think about how we can embed that study with students of whatever age level in these embedded circles. So the first is simply recognizing that cultures always operate within a geographical context, and that we need to help our students get a sense of what that geographical context is and the kind of constant interactions and adaptations that are a part of that geographical context. And then that is embedded within a historical context that shapes cultural forms and values. And then in the center, that cultures are always part of an underlying system of values and beliefs that are social, political, aesthetic, economic, that serve basic functions and shape what we consider the norm within our particular cultural community and the ways in which we make meaning. And this model has become very important to us as we engage in planning. Now, the other frame that we're going to use a lot throughout this sharing with you when we share the strategies is cosmopolitanism. And it's a philosophy that really says that we are all citizens of the cosmos, of the universe. And what David Hansen says is that in order to bring a global perspective, that we need to our lives, or in this case, to a study of a particular culture, is that we need to balance reflective loyalty to the known with reflective openness to the new. In other words, we have to be aware of our own beliefs and our own values, and that our awareness of our own cultural locations as our home then allows us to more deeply and productively create a bridge in order to understand an unfamiliar global culture. And that we have to balance both of those in order to really develop a global perspective. And that's what we're going to do a lot of sharing with you about today. That our students need to be open to learning from, not just merely tolerating others. And we really, really wanted to get beyond this notion of tolerating. That seemed way too low a bar to us. And one of the things that we really believed is that when you engage children or adults in global literature, in story, that it engages their narrative imaginations, that what they're able to do is to imagine themselves within a story world. And within that story world, in this particular global culture, they connect with characters as people, and they start to feel emotional connections and empathy. And they get to experience what people actually feel, live, and think in that culture, instead of just getting some surface information as if they were a tourist in that place. So we're going to start by talking about reflective loyalty to the known, because we really believe that children need to be able to see themselves as cultural beings and to value culture as integral to their lives. Because if you don't see culture as significant to you, then you're much more likely to view someone else who you see as having, in quotes, culture as being the exotic or the other. So we realize that if children see that they themselves have a value, they themselves have culture and have beliefs and values, then they're much more likely to value that in somebody else's life, in cultures that differ from their own. So we spent time really building this reflective loyalty to the known, helping children to become aware and reflect on their cultural beliefs and values, and particular thinking about what are you loyal to in your heart? What's your home, using the word home broadly, that gives you a sense of stability from which you can then venture out into the new and to not be threatened by the new. We also really focused on, what about your values are continuous and carry across different situations and have integrity for you rather than identity markers. And what I mean by identity markers are just labeling yourself. I'm white, I'm female, I'm middle class. We have lots and lots of labels that we often use to explore identity. And we found that those labels are actually get in the way. That what we wanted more to know is, what are you really loyal to? What carries across? So we're going to share right now connections to children's lives as cultural beings, and then strategies we used for that, and strategies we use to create bridges from their lives to other cultures.
And one of the ways that we invited children to start thinking about their own personal and family cultural identities was to have them think about the special names that loved ones call them in their family. And one of our favorite books to use with children and adults around this is Little Treasures Endearments from Around the World. I'm just going to share a few pages of this book with you. So this book starts, all over the world, mothers and fathers, grandparents and cousins, brothers and sisters, uncles and aunts love their children very much and call them by many different sweet names. Hindi-speaking parents, grandparents, uncles, and aunts love their children very much and call them sweet names such as my Ruby, Miralal, my baby doll, Miragura, my princess, Mirarani, and my sweet little moon, Mirachanda. In Australia, families call their children Flossie, Possum, and Lamb Chop. One more. Arabic-speaking families love their children very much and call them a part of my existence, Danaya, honey, Asal, beloved, Habibiti, and light of my heart, Nukwalbi. In Ethiopia, Amharic-speaking people love their children very much, and parents call their children my beauty, Yene Kwanjo, my bubble of joy, Yene Falilik, and my berry, Yene and Juris. Spanish-speaking mothers and fathers, grandparents and cousins, brothers and sisters, uncles and aunts love their children very much and call them by many, many endearments. In Chile, families call their children sweet names, such as my chick, mi pollita, little piece of heaven, pedacito de cielo, little fatty, gordito, and little angel, angelito. No matter where they live, or what language they speak, all around the world, families love their children very much and use many different endearments. All those mothers, fathers, grandparents, cousins, brothers, sisters, aunts, and uncles, whether they say sweetie pie, mirachanda, angelito, or use their own special sweet names, they are all saying the same thing. I love you, child. So we want to invite you, we're going to put you into some small breakout rooms in just a moment. And in these breakout rooms, we want you to consider, what were you lovingly called as a child by your family members or loved ones around you? Who called you this? Why did they call you this endearment? And are there loving names that you call the children in your life? We're going to drop a link into the chat right now. I will put it in there right now. And you can open this. This is going to have a series of 3 slides that we're going to be using in breakout rooms. So if you have it, we'll refer back to this over the course of the presentation. And so we'd ask you in these breakout rooms to look at these prompts, to share with each other and share both the endearment as it was told to you in the language that you heard it, and then translate it into English if necessary. So we'll open those breakout rooms and make sure you've opened the slides before you go in, and I'll open them right now. So thank you for sharing your stories with each other. And throughout our sessions, there were ongoing opportunities like this for children to make connections to their own identities and lives as cultural beings in a global world. So we used a variety of mapping engagements to help students think about this. So we used world and US maps when children first introduced them to each other and to us, to share the places in the world that were significant to them, their families, journey stories, and as well as using neighborhood, something we call neighborhood memory maps, where children drew a place that was special to them and labeled stories and memories that took place there. We also used graffiti boards to brainstorm connections that they had with the global cultures in which we were exploring, as well as, you can see on the bottom right, heart map collages, where children did that really deep reflective loyalty to the known to think about what was really deeply embedded in their hearts, what were they loyal to, and what was really significant and important to their lives. When children saw themselves as cultural beings, as Kathy said, and really began to value culture as integral to their own lives, they began to be much more open in considering and valuing this in the lives of the people of the cultures of which we were exploring. And right here are just, two examples of the neighborhood memory maps. So on the top, you see a child that drew, a 5th grader that drew their neighborhood. And labeled the stories and memories important to them. On the bottom right is actually a single house with rooms and stories happening there.
Another way in which we worked with children on reflective loyalty to the known was to help them explore and think about how they could build a bridge from their culture to another culture. So we wanted children to think about how they connect to children in another global context and how we value what makes each culture unique. In other words, we wanted them to at the same time think about both connection and difference, because we wanted to avoid 2 things. One was we wanted to avoid kids that looking at only focusing on what's in common across all cultures, which leads to universalizing, acting as if there's no differences. All that really matters is how we connect on the inside. But at the same time, so we wanted them to think about connection, but at the same time, we wanted them to think about difference. And we know, again, if you only look at difference, then you end up talking about difference in a negative way, how different someone is from you. And that can very much exoticize or lead to children labeling a culture as strange or weird. So we wanted them at the same time to think about both connection and difference, and to hold that complexity. And that we knew that that might not necessarily be easy for them. So we wanted them to view connection and difference as essential to intercultural understanding. We wanted them to be able to create a bridge if they were exploring something new, to see how that new connected back to their own lives. And we also wanted them to be able to do it the other way, to start with something that was known to them and then make the bridge to something that's new. So one of the strategies that we used a lot is a global protocol. And it's called Comparing to Understand. It was a protocol that we created because of some earlier work we were doing with young children. And the protocol consists of 4 parts. And this is a protocol that we've used, as we've said, with lots of different ages. We'll give you an example with the children. But the protocol consists, first of all, of children looking at 2 things. And it might be 2 photographs, it might be 2 books, it might be 2 objects. But what one is the known, and one is something new. And what they're first looking for is looking for connections and similarities. You know, what is it that connects us in these 2 situations they're looking at? What is it that looks similar across the 2? And then the second thing we ask them to do is to look for what's unique and different, in order for them to really think about what are the differences that make each culture rich and unique. And so they're looking at, again, if it's 2 photographs or if it's 2 books or 2 objects, what's unique about each situation, you know, what makes these 2 situations look different. And then the third part of the protocol is to ask the deep questions, to ask why. Why do we think there might be differences between these 2? What are the possible reasons for why there might be different actions or some differences across these 2 situations? And we know that often children in particular may not know the reasons why, but what we want them to think about is that there's always a reason. That, for example, someone in India is wearing a sari, that differs from the clothing that you're wearing right now. That it's not just something strange, there's a reason behind it. And then the fourth question, fourth part of the protocol is going beyond, to recognize that we never fully understand a culture that's not our own, and thinking about what more do I need to know, recognizing that our knowledge is incomplete. So that protocol, we're going to have you, again, put you in small groups. And you're going to get an invitation to join. So please be sure that you join your group. We noticed the last time some of you didn't join. So you have to click on join in order to go. So this is a protocol we did with children that was related to our global cultural study that we did around Korea. And so we asked the children to compare the 3 photographs on the left are photographs of how they went to their school. So we took those photographs right outside the school. And then the 2 photographs, we actually had more than that, but we're just showing you 2 today. The 2 photographs on the right were photographs of children going to school in Korea. And so we asked them to think about, what are these 2 contexts look similar? What looks different? What are the possible reasons for why there might be differences for how children are going to school in Korea than in Tucson? And then what more do you need to understand? We hope you had a good discussion. The children were really interested and were really impressed that all the children that they saw in these pictures were walking, and that they had a separate roadway, part of the roadway that was just for them. So they, sometimes we just did this as a discussion, and sometimes we actually filled it out. In this case, this was a small group, and the adult was writing what the children were brainstorming, what they noticed as the connections between the 2, the differences. what they were really wondering about, why the reasons were for the differences, and then what they felt they still needed to know. And as I said, you know, we see this as setting up a frame of mind so that children and adults, as they begin to think about how connecting to a culture that's new to them, they think about both connections, differences, they think about the reasons why those differences might exist, and then also always recognize that they need to know more. And we use this protocol in a range of ways. One time we were looking at all the different ways that people play jacks around the world. And so the kids did some comparisons between the way that they knew and another way to play jacks in another place. Another time we were looking at doing some work with India, and we'd set up some centers that the kids were participating with that all had to do with the ways in which people within that particularly Hindu culture, the ways in which they made connections to important people in their lives. And so they thought about how they do that. And then they looked at, they engaged in these centers to make Rakhi bracelets and Mendi and think about Hindu names. And as they did that, they then came back and thought about how their ways they make connections to important people in their lives, how it was similar, different, the reasons why, as well as what they would need to know more. So it was a protocol that we continuously integrated and did with lots of different kinds of photographs and books and objects.
At the end of each of our sessions, children took home what we called home conversations. So these were half sheets of paper. They had 1 or 2 questions on them to really encourage them to make connections from what we were exploring in the club sessions, from those explorations to their home cultures in ways that really invited their family stories in. So we asked them specifically to ask their parents, ask their grandparents, ask other family members these questions. We were really intentional in the types of questions that we asked. We really wanted to be careful that we didn't fall into asking stereotypical questions or questions that would really stay on the surface level of that cultural iceberg that Kathy shared earlier. So for example, after doing a deep exploration of the significance of rice within Korean culture, we did many engagements, had lots of discussions, read books about how it was grown and used, looked at seasons around the growing of rice, and even made and ate kimbap with the students. We didn't ask whether or not families ate rice or how they ate rice, but rather we went deeper to ask what food is significant to your family. Children loved these home conversations. They loved sharing their family stories, and they were often really excited to share maybe juicy details they had heard, for example, when we asked them what their parents and grandparents were lovingly called as children. Our goal as we moved to thinking from reflective loyalty of the known, we wanted to balance those experiences of really connecting and thinking about what was important to their own culture, their family cultures, into inviting them into reflective openness to the new. So one of our big concerns in immersing children in new cultures was really ensuring that we provided broad representations of the diversity within that culture so that they didn't fall into forming stereotypes or essentializing the culture in specific ways. So we continue to refer back to that Begler model that Kathy shared earlier to think about all of the connections and contexts that were important to consider. Knowing that our children came to us with various backgrounds and experiences, we wanted to create a shared context in which they could notice and wonder about a new culture together. And so we did these book browsings at the beginning of every single session. We quickly realized that just doing 1 or 2 read alouds from a cultural community wasn't enough. We ran the risk again of essentializing the culture or only showing very limited views of it. But instead, these time to browse and immerse themselves deeply in books, to notice and wonder together, really provided a much more broad and a view that was more broad and more representative of the culture that we were exploring. Many of the books that we used for these browsing sessions came from our language and culture kits. So these are carefully curated sets of books and resources around global languages, global cultural communities, available for local teachers to check out and use in their classrooms. These lists and the lists of books and information about how these can be checked out can be found on our Worlds of Words website at wowlit.org.
Right, and they're annotated book lists, so many of you are not places where you could ever check them out, but you can find the annotated book lists for many of these different global cultures on the Worlds of Words website, if you wanted to put a set together to use with a group of students.
So occasionally, so again, as I said, we started these sessions with browsing, and children would often come. We ran our club after school, and there was a 15-minute break between the bell ending and the day ending and our club starting. And children often showed up early because they wanted to dive in and start reading the books. Occasionally, children, we would see them all gathered around a particular book, and there would be giggles and there would be hushed whispering. And this usually signaled to us that something in the book had challenged their expectations. So for example, in this book, this is a Korean book written in Hangul, completely in Hangul. So the children weren't familiar with the written language. And they were really surprised to find a grandmother and a child swimming without their clothes on. And they had many, many questions for our colleague Hee Young about this. And so she explained to them that these were actually public baths that were separated by gender, and not actually the swimming pool, the public swimming pool that children assumed it to be from their own cultural perspectives. In another instance, we were exploring sets of books around India, and children were really confused by this book called Cricket. They saw the images, they picked it up, and they assumed that it was baseball. And they were really puzzled by the different equipment that was being used to play this. So we continued to see the ways that children brought their own cultural expectations into the reading and browsing that they were doing, and the ways that the books offered many opportunities to challenge these. Another really important source of creating broader context for children was the opportunity to examine maps. And again, this free exploration, not teacher-directed activities, but a place for them to gather around maps and notice and wonder and engage in curiosities together. So we actually used 3 sets of maps. So we would always show children, give them a detailed map of the country or community that we were engaging in exploration around. But then we also included a map that had the surrounding countries, as well as a third world map, so that children really could see all the layers and connections and context of that particular area. And in these spaces, they made connections to places that were familiar to them. They attempted to read the unfamiliar names of cities and towns, and they had so many really interesting questions about borders that they saw, cities and landforms. So this time, again, to explore freely was really important.
We, of course, spent a long time in reflective openness to the new, because we were doing specifically 2 cultural inquiries. One was around South Korea and the other was around India. And we had university students who were from those countries who were supporting us along in this study. And one of our concerns was how to connect the surface culture to the deep culture. Initially, because we were doing this as an after-school club, we realized both of us had taught for many years in classrooms, but hadn't done after school. And the problem with after school is the kids are tired, like they've been in school all day. And so we found ourselves doing lots of games and activities with them to keep them engaged, but that actually didn't result in any deep understanding. So when we did these units at the next year with the kids, we really spent a lot of time trying to think about how to create the connection between the games, the focus on festivals and foods and so forth, with some kind of deeper understanding. We found we could particularly do that through read aloud. So let me give you a couple of examples. So for example, the first time we did the unit, we of course tasted kimbap, but it was just an activity to taste the food. The second time we did it, in the second unit, we were very careful to embed that experience within a deeper understanding of rice and the significance of rice within Korea. So we used both photographs found from the internet as well as the book Cycle of Rice to talk about the rice fields and how rice is grown. We read aloud bibimbap so the kids could see that rice was there in every single meal, that it was a daily food. And therefore then tasting that food became much more significant to the children. And they also had some really interesting discussions between sushi as a Japanese term and kimbap as a Korean term. And then in thinking about the festivals, we read a book called Sori's Harvest Moon Day, which indicated how important rice was to special events and festivals. And the importance of asking for rain for rice. We did some music and drumming that involved Korean songs that were requests for rice. The same thing when we did Rangoli, and creating the designs of Rangoli out on the sidewalk with rice powders, colored rice powders. What we did was very carefully first establish that within a context. We had several books that engage children in thinking about Rangoli within the life of children within India. And then Rena also brought in photographs and talked about Rangoli as an art form and talked about it being drawn in the morning at the entrance of a household to welcome God, guests, good health, wealth, and success to the neighborhood. And those were very plain, straightforward, but then the more elaborate Rangoli that are created during festivals, religious celebrations, or family occasions like weddings. And then the kids went out to create their Rangolis in the school courtyard that the rest of their classmates would see the following morning. Or when we talked about the value of family and connection to important people in our lives, we didn't just make the Rakhi bracelets. We first had the kids brainstorm people in their lives who are important to them and all the different ways they show connections to those people. But we looked at a Hindi language tree of family names, and then the children created their own family names in their journals. We read aloud a picture book called Thread of Love, and then the children made the Rakhi bracelets to give to someone in their lives, creating this deeper context before we went into the activity. So what we want to do is to go into breakout groups and to think about the kinds of foods that are significant to your family. And we've created a set of questions that come back to the Begler model. So the Begler model shows how you can take something like food, which is often done at a very surface level. Let's taste these exotic foods from this culture that differs from our own. And instead, think about food in a way that's deeper. So we're going to put you in partners. So we do need everybody to join, to hit the join, because if you'll leave somebody by themselves if you don't. So we're going to ask you to think about what is a food that's significant to your family? When do you eat? And you don't have to answer all these questions, but the ones that are most relevant. When do you eat this food? At a certain time of day or certain time of year? Who do you eat this food with? Why is this food significant to your family? Does it connect to your family history or to someplace or to where your family lived or originated? Who prepares the food? How is it prepared? Who serves the food? And are there certain rituals or routines in serving this food? So again, the set of questions was created using the Begler model as a way to think about food, but in a way that's deeper, that recognizes more of the where it's rooted.
Great, welcome back. So again, we wanted just to highlight the ways that we can move beyond some of the typical questions that we use to explore culture to think about all of the deeper contextual pieces that are important to helping us understand more deeply. So we move now to thinking about the ways that we thought and integrated language into our sessions. So as we know, language is essential to culture and completely intertwined in all aspects. And so therefore we carefully integrated it across all of our sessions with children. Initially, we placed our sort of focused language lessons at the end of our inquiry units of study because they felt like they may be more difficult for the children to engage them, and we thought the context would help them. However, what we found is that children were fascinated by the language study. They had so much interest in it. It felt like a game and a puzzle that they needed to figure out, and it was important to them to understand it. And we also recognized that the language was really an important context for which children could make connections to all of the various components and aspects that we were discussing. So we moved our focus language lessons more towards the beginning. Children had lots and lots of opportunities across the sessions to read and practice writing and speaking the language. So the books that we browsed in those browsing sessions included both interlingual and bilingual books, as well as those that were published completely in Hindi or Hangul. We also did some read aloud. So with the help of our colleagues, or in this case, with the help from our colleague Hee Young, we were able to read together an interlingual book in both English and Hangul so that children were able to hear the Korean and the English in the dialogue as it was written and presented in the story. And were then able to think about the significance of multilingualism in their own lives and the lives around them. We integrated meaningful words into our sessions as well. So children learned to say annyeong and namaste. They greeted each other. They greeted anybody who walked into our classroom, and they were really, really insistent if we forgot to do this that we did. So knowing the language, being able to speak some of it became really significant for the children. And again, the language was embedded in every single exploration we did. So whether we were singing songs in languages, whether we were doing chants while we were working with the Korean drummings, children used both Korean and Hindi as they engaged in Taekwondo and yoga. And children learned to examine, you can see some charts here, children learn to look at the language and figure out how to write their own names in the language. And I said these were puzzles that they were really excited and felt really strongly about understanding. And their names written in other languages became one of their most prized possessions.
And in this particular case, our major focus wasn't that they learned to speak the languages, but we wanted them to explore the language as part of the cultural studies that we were doing. We know some of you are language teachers, so that would be your major focus. Our focus was primarily on the culture. We did also, as we've noted, part of the reflective openness to the new was the role of cultural insiders. So in our case, we did invite someone who was from that culture, who happened to be a university student, to come with us and both to plan and to be part of the experiences with us. But we were also, in other cases, that might be not a consultant, it might be a guest expert, a family member, a community member. In one case, we were doing a study later on about New Zealand, and we had someone join us by Zoom into one of our sessions. What we found is that having an expert at some point involved in our explorations really provided support in connecting the surface culture to the deep culture. And also the children had many, many questions about daily life and what daily life is like. And they wanted to speak to somebody who's actually part of that culture. And that knowing someone who came out, for whom that was their own culture, also provided the children with important sense of connection and relationship. They were really excited about that. And when we ended our units, we decided against doing some kind of presentation where kids were presenting to each other, because we saw the learning that they were doing as ongoing, and wanting them to see that learning as continuing on rather than doing some kind of report to close the inquiry. So we ended up with Korea doing a tea ceremony And that was so significant that we ended up with each cultural unit we were doing, we did a tea ceremony, and children invited their family members to that experience. They did it, and we put on a laptop pictures of some of the explorations we had done. So there was a lot of sharing rather than presenting. And it was interesting to watch when family members were sitting at the tea party, how careful and how important it was to the children that the family members do it correctly. And we also started seeing them make comments about their interest in their daily lives. So for example, we had a grandmother who came to the tea party who said, now I know why Cassandra wants to go for her birthday to the Korean restaurant. So we began to hear from family members how much the children were taking what we were doing and integrating it into their daily lives. The father at one of our meetings came in early, and he looked at his daughter and she gave him a face and he said, I know, this is very important to you. I'll wait outside for 15 minutes. She just didn't want to miss any of those experiences. The other thing that we did was we always spent time in journals at the end of each session with the children, and they wrote something they'd learned that day and something they were still wondering about. So we're going to stop the screen share at this point and give you a chance to ask questions about something that we've talked about that you want more explanation. So we'll open up for questions, and then we also have the final evaluations and forms. So who has a question? You can put your mic on. I'm going to start with Bridget, because Bridget says, what did you do with their reflections of what they learned and still needed to learn? We read those at the end of each session, and they helped us to see what kind of connections kids were making, what was significant to them within the sessions we were doing with children, and also what kind of misunderstandings might be there or things they were still wondering about. So it helped us plan for the next session. So we didn't respond to them in the journals because their journals were theirs, but we did read them and use them for planning.
And Bridget, just to follow up, I think, yeah, so in terms of leaving them with us, so we kept their journals. They kept this ongoing record of their learnings and their wonderings and important things that they had gathered, maps and so forth, that we kept during the sessions. But then at the end of each semester, we would give these back to children to keep with them.
Yeah, so the journals recorded all of their inquiries across. They were collecting things in those all the way along in addition to writing in them. These were 3rd to 5th graders, so they would have been 9 to 11 years old.
We found, that the best way to start for us were really those browsings of books. So having such a wide variety of books for children to browse freely was what invited their questions in. It's what let us see what they were connecting to, maybe what they were passing over. So those times of unstructured browsing across many different kinds of books really gave us insights into how we wanted to think about our sessions with the children.
We also started every new unit with the protocol of the photographs of how they go to school at their school, and then how do they go, and then how children in that particular global culture went to school, because we found that was a really easy point of connection for them, so that they could immediately begin thinking about reason. And we also wanted them from the beginning to think about reasons why there might be differences within this culture. But we found the reason we didn't start by asking, what do you want to know about Korea? What do you want to know about India? Was because, to be frank, they didn't know much. And their question, and so it was better to start by just immersing them in some experiences and then watch their questions grow.
I think Amy also has her hand up there with a question.
Amy?
Oh, I thank you. I put it in the chat, actually. I was just wondering what, if you have a bibliography, because I like to read more about the Begler model, the David Hansen, the Global Protocol.
Yeah, you know what, we did create a bibliography of books, but we actually, the books that are in there right now are the children's books that we mentioned. So we will add the professional references to that. I realized that we didn't do that. And we'll add that, and then it'll be reposted on the Circle website. But I'll do that
Great,
immediately. As soon as we end today, I'll add those references.
Okay, thank you.
And just to let you know, the Begler model, she has, it's available easily on the internet. So I'll also put that link in there. It's a really nice short article that's called Global Cultures, the First Steps Toward Understanding by Elsie Begler. But it's just like 3 pages long, and it's really helpful. Other questions?
I'm seeing lots of people saying how important this work is, so I'm going to point that out.
So one of the things that we see within our location, even though we are very diverse, is that children aren't necessarily open to or knowledgeable about global cultures. And that's when you talk about the importance of the work. You know, what our real goal was not that they come away with a bunch of facts, but that they come away with perspectives of understanding. How do we change these activities with our university students? So one of the things that we found with the university students is they need to experience these engagements in order to then think about how to use them with children. So for example, the global protocol, we used it pretty much the same with the undergraduates as we do with the children. We had a broader range of photographs that we used with them, but we wanted them to experience that thinking themselves and then and then we would share how we did it with children. And that's why we did it with you. We wanted you to have that experience to think about then how you might use that engagement with your own students. We wanted them to experience that kind of thinking themselves. And we do a lot of reading of literature with our university students as well, both browsing and read alouds. Dorea, what would you add?
I think I just used the protocol last week with my university students, looking at just taking a picture book that they were exploring and using it in terms of that. So I think the beauty of the protocol is that it can be used both formally in lots of different settings, but also it becomes the language that we use when we're asking for further discussion, those why questions and how questions and what more do we need to know, so that becomes the frame and the language that's always happening around all of our explorations.
So one of the problems for us with this particular, so as I said, both of us have been classroom teachers and work in classrooms all the time. And so one of the problems for us was that this was an after school program, which meant that it could only meet for 90 minutes one time a week. And the units that we described to you were 6 weeks long. So there was a real limitation of time and the once a week. And one of the things we couldn't get to was in the kids doing their own investigations, going into their own inquiries. And so when somebody asked, what would you do next? It would really be that I would have liked for them to be able to have longer time to actually do their own inquiries at the end of the 6 weeks to brainstorm what their questions were, and then go into researching and exploring to answer those questions. And the after school context didn't allow for that in a way that I've always had time to do when it was within a classroom and we could do it daily.
We've been starting to do some work with teachers now of being able to explore some of these ideas with teachers and then having them be able to do them in classrooms where they have that extended amount of time. So, and then being able to come back and share resources and ideas of what this might look like in classroom settings outside of an after school program.
I think that last question in there also opens up a lot of spaces. I saw a comment about, turning this into research in a different context, like with university students or older students, high school even. And one of the breakout groups I was in, we were talking about how you could connect this to things like critical literacy and critical media literacy, because recognizing that that view you're getting of culture, even the one that you yourself live within, is always mediated through things like images. So I think there's a lot of places that last question could already start to open up. There's a question from Lauren too about, do you have plans for piloting this with different age groups?
I'm an early childhood teacher educator, so I am dying to get in there and start working with our really youngest learners, our preschool and kindergarten age learners, and our early elementary. So that's definitely an area of focus that I'm interested in exploring.
I see Amy has a hand up too.
Sorry, it's me again. I have lots of inquiry. My question is, have you thought about looking at maybe quantitatively studying the benefits of this program?
At this point, we felt that it was exploratory, and so we've gathered a lot of qualitative data. And so that's where our focus has been. And it also felt the most appropriate because, to be honest, so we were both, while we're teacher educators, we were the teachers in these settings as well as the researchers. And so these quantitative measures didn't feel appropriate. The qualitative felt most appropriate since it was action research. It's not that it's not possible. I just think the qualitative was the most appropriate given our context.
Yeah. Thank you.
Teachers.
And Mohammed, I saw your question about whether we think that children's minds are able to receive the different cultures. And I would say absolutely yes, especially as we had children think about themselves as cultural beings. Their curiosity and wanting to really then understand what that was like for others and other cultural beings in their world was really, really important to them. And they were absolutely open and just wanting more and more the longer we were with them.
I saw also a comment about the language development. One thing, as a person who teaches languages, that I was interested in is how quickly the kids told you languages need to come in there right up front with culture, that the two are connected, which I love. Lori has a hand up as well for a question.
Yeah, hi, and hi to Kathy. Gosh, it's been decades since I've seen you, since Robin. So good to. I'm jumping in because I want to get involved with producing music for, the whatever I can do to do that. I'm learning to produce right now finally, and but I really want to jump in somehow. So I'm here just to kind of start getting connected because I think this is so important. And if I can come up with some way to get involved to share through music and song, that I would love to do that. So I'm just that's why I'm here, just to get started and see what you guys are up to. It's wonderful what you're doing.
Yeah, when we were doing another study, which we haven't shared at all today, that was looking at multilingualism, we ended up doing some work with Māori, the indigenous culture of New Zealand. And the kids learned a very important song that's sung in Māori. And we were amazed. We had it in one club session, and the next club session, the kids were already singing it by themselves as they were working.
Wow.
So it just showed us how important music is to that, in both immersing them within the culture as well as the language.
Right. So I don't know. I want to get connected. So let me know if anything's coming up where I can jump in. Okay. So it's good to see you.
And Bridget, your just comment about when we invite family stories in, just the diversity, the cultural diversity that exists within even a single class, and in our case, 8 to 12 students, is huge. And what we found was that children really, we're so, especially in our schools, so content driven, that opportunity to really talk and share stories and ask families not to do homework around content areas, but to actually engage in conversations over the phone with parents and grandparents or extended family members, and then have a space where they could share that and make connections and think about similarities and differences within our small group was exactly what you said. It gave us so much just within those students in that small group.
Yeah, those little half sheets that we call the home conversations, that's what allowed a lot of sharing from families. That was really, and they loved, it always asked them, what are the endearments of your family member, of your, within your, your direct family, but then were there endearments that were used with your grandparents to go back generations? And those two questions were really, really significant to the kids, that they both looked at their immediate family and then their extended family.
It also created a space where families came in more, I think. They saw themselves as integral parts of our program. And so it was really like, they often just stopped by and hung out. We had family members just end up grandparents coming to visit, and children invited them to sit and spend the whole sessions with us. So I think those types of questions also signal to families that they are actually invited and welcomed parts of the school space as well.
I think that's really interesting as well, because I work with older learners. I was thinking of the focus on the family and on things like endearments and what do you hold dear, how that immediately shifts the conversation away from kind of a cultural ambassador sort of position where I have to speak for what do the Americans do, and instead kind of opens up a much more complex discussion of culture as well.
And we were surprised the first time we used that. We had a couple of kids who'd been assigned to the after school club, and they wanted to be in the sports club instead, and they were really ticked off that they were in our club. And they shared the endearments. That was something that we sat there where I just thought they would just say and kind of laugh it off. They were fifth graders, and they're kind of big stuff. And they shared their endearments, and it clearly meant a lot to them. It was a really special moment.
I love that. I see lots of praise coming in, and I think many of you have already noted that the evaluation has popped up. So please make sure to do that. And Kate has also been sharing speaking of quantitative and qualitative, a more qualitative evaluation. Please do both. We use them not only for our own feedback for developing things, but to continue to apply for grants and funding to support projects like this and webinars like this. We've got just a couple more minutes, so if there is one more question, we can sneak one in.
Hello, guys, I would like to start with apology because I was extremely late today for personal stuff, but I'm working with children's literature, both in English or Spanish. So I would like to continue the conversation because in my classes, dual enrollment classes, I'm using the children's literature in order to analyze the visual representation, for instance, and in different levels. So I would like to even work with you, receive your input in order to improve this idea. I think that from the perspective, the linguistic perspective, children's book is a big door that we are not using as much as we should. And I would love to be part of that learning experience because I see the benefit to talk about some other cultures, some other languages, appreciate even the feedback that students can provide through their very own experiences being or bilingual and have the opportunity to live in two different, like a bicultural household. So I would love to be part of that initiative of whatever. I'm ready to learn from you, and thank you for that.
Thank you. That's a strong interest of mine as well. So I would using literature in terms of supporting language learners. So I'd love to, definitely would love to talk with you more.
Well, now it's 11:30, and I want to echo and amplify all of the praise that's coming in the chat. That will make sure also that Kathy and Dorea get if they missed it while answering questions. Many people saying how incredibly helpful and inspiring this is, and also seeing lots of the ways in which it can connect into other educational contexts beyond the ones that you were working with. And so please join me, everybody, in thanking Kathy and Dorea once more for this wonderful webinar.